Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Jean Murley. I teach in the English department here. I don't think any of my students are here, are you? No? But maybe I will have you in a class one day. So we have a very special guest here today. I know that you've been reading Picking Cotton. Yay, Picking Cotton. We love it, right? It's an amazing book. It's totally amazing. And we're so pleased that so many of you are reading the book, and we have put together a 3-week series of events. So this is week 1, and we have a very exciting guest today who's going to talk about wrongful conviction. I just wanted to introduce him. His name is Reuven Fenton, and he is a journalist, and he has been covering murder and scandal for the New York Post, some of you might read the Post, since 2007. And he has earned national recognition for his exclusive reporting on a myriad of national stories. Mr. Fenton was inspired to write Stolen Years after covering an unforgettable court hearing in 2013 in which a Brooklyn judge freed a man named David Ranta, who had been wrongfully convicted for murdering a rabbi 22 years earlier. The sensational story sparked an investigation into misconduct by both the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and the lead detective in the case. Mr. Fenton is a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism, and he lives right here in New York City with his wife and 2 sons. So please help me welcome Mr. Reuven Fenton.
I'm honored, thank you. And thank you for taking the time out to sit and hear my lecture. It appears that this is a topic that's of interest to you, which is great. You're here voluntarily, and you seem to have a genuine interest in this topic, which I'm really happy about, because it's an increasingly, it was always an important topic, but it's becoming the whole wrongful conviction phenomenon, the increasing exonerations every year, is becoming a greater topic of interest as years go by. So thank you so much for showing your interest and for hearing me out. So as Professor Murley said, and as you can see, I'm the author of this book, Stolen Years, which came out in November, and I'm going to talk about the book and tell you some of the stories that are in the book and how it relates to the issue at large. I'm going to walk you through the 5 major causes of wrongful conviction and use examples from the book to illustrate what those causes are. But I'm going to start by, I think, telling you a little bit about myself, a little bit more about myself, and how I came to write this book. So since 2007, I have been a reporter at the New York Post, which is the infamous New York City tabloid that, we're kind of most famous for our headlines, probably. This is a typical New York Post cover from July of 2014. I just picked it kind of randomly when I Googled New York Post covers. But our website, I think, these days is more popular than the actual newspaper, but that's common among, I think, all newspapers. But in any event, one of the great things about working for the New York Post is that we really dig deep into the kind of criminal, the gritty underbelly of New York City. I cover such a wide variety of stories that it's actually kind of impossible to summarize what it is that I do. But a large percentage of the stories that I cover have to do with crime. Yesterday I was in the Bronx because this guy who'd been holding like a placard outside of a cell phone store, some other guy just stabbed him to death, outside the store, which is a story that, I hate to kind of speak of it as a commodity, but there have been so many stabbings and shootings that I've covered that I can't even remember half of them anymore, unfortunately. This coming week, I'm going to be going back to, previous week I've been in Nashville, Tennessee all week covering this trial of Erin Andrews. She's the sportscaster who a few years ago, someone was filming her naked through a peephole of her hotel. Some of you may remember that story. So she's suing for $75 million, and her trial is continuing next week, so I'll be going back down there to continue that. But the point is that I mean, crime is such a vast subject in and of itself when I'm even covering crime. And it really kind of gives me a feel for, for so many crime-related elements. And one of them that that kind of got me interested in this topic is I started noticing in last few years that I'd been assigned to cover exonerations, which I had never covered when I first started. And it became this thing that almost became like a routine assignment in and of itself, sort of like covering, shootings and murders and mayhem. The exoneration story became its own kind of subcategory of news that I kind of cover on a relatively regular basis. And the first one I ever covered was for a man named David Ranta. David Ranta is this. This picture was taken in 1990, I believe, or maybe it was 1989. I think it was 1990. Ranta's story is this. One day in 1990, there was a Hasidic jewelry dealer who was carrying a 50-pound suitcase full of diamonds that he was going to go fly down to the Dominican Republic for. His name was Weinberger, was his last name. Anyway, somebody approached him, accosted him, held a gun up to him, and he sped off in his car and took off. The gunman then, for reasons unclear, spotted a rabbi named Haskell Wurzberger in his car, and he went up to him, he shot him in the head, took his car and sped off. The rabbi who was shot in the head died 3 days later in the hospital. The perpetrator, well, it's unclear if he was ever caught, but the man who ended up getting arrested was this fellow here. The witnesses had described the gunman as having blonde hair, being such and such height. I mean, the description was pretty vague, but the man to his left, this guy right here, is a detective by the name of Louis Scarcella. Louis Scarcella's name has come up in the news a lot recently. Basically, because it's been discovered that, well, at the time this picture was taken, Louis Scarcella was like a star detective for the New York City Police Department. He was really one of the best. He was a detective in Brooklyn. He was a guy who would solve cases that no one else could solve. All those, impossible cases, he would get assigned them. And he had this knack for solving cases. And he was famous throughout the department he and his partner for solving these cases. And this was one of his big ones that he solved. What's come to light in more recent years is that Scarcella used all sorts of cheating kind of tactics to get convictions, whether that involved basically persuading witnesses to pick out that guy in the lineup in particular, or basically hiring witnesses. He used one witness that he hired, I think 6 times for 6 different murders. He used the same witness. He did all these things to basically kind of cheat into getting convictions, because every detective wants a really good, it's kind of like being a star tennis player or something. You want to have like the most wins. And that was kind of his whole motivation. So he's under all sorts of investigation now, and all of the cases that he solved are being reevaluated now. Several people have gotten out of prison already on cases that he was involved in convictions of. So Ranta was the first big one. Okay, and so I was sent to cover David Ranta's exoneration, where it was found after after 23 years in prison that he was. That there was not nearly enough evidence to have cast any kind of doubt to his innocence, and he should be freed, a judge ruled. So I went to the courthouse to cover this, and I'd never seen anything like it. It was an experience I'll never forget. This was in 2013. I sat down, and basically it was a relatively quick court hearing in which the judge told David Ranter, you're free to go. The court officer uncuffed him. He had this mesh sack of all his worldly possessions, or whatever he'd gotten, in 23 years in prison, whatever he owned was in this bag that he was kind of carrying over his shoulder like this, and he walked through the gated area in the middle of the courtroom to the galleys in the back, and he hugged his daughter. That's his daughter. He hugged her for the first time as a free man, and it was such a stirring. I mean, I'm watching this, and I feel like I'm like watching a movie here. Just think about it. I mean, 23 years for a crime you apparently did not commit. And I was like, well, and I think, and that was what sparked the idea that, well, I didn't quite have the idea yet, but that was what sparked what eventually led to me writing Stolen Years. So, but now, as a news person, so when you cover breaking news, which is what I do, it's like we describe ourselves as short order cooks. We cover the day's news, we dish it out, and then the next day we move on to the next story, and like almost as if the previous day's story never even happened. That's my hand right there. That's my recorder. It really is. So, so I was covering this, and what's part of the routine is after the guy is freed by the judge, he goes. There's this big press conference, and there were like, I don't know, maybe 36 reporters all facing him. Every news station you could think of, every website, every newspaper. And then, so you get a few questions to ask. All right, so how do you feel? You're out as a free man. What's it like? He's like, oh, it's amazing. It's great. What are you going to do? What are you going to do for your first thing as a free man? What are you going to do first? He's like, oh, I'm going to go celebrate with my family. I'm going to get something to eat, probably get some new clothes. It's very, very superficial questions, which are appropriate for the breaking news format, but at the same time, I'm sitting here watching this. I'm looking at a guy who has a 23-year-long story to tell, and we're not even scratching the surface here. I mean, this guy has an amazing story. I mean, I'm thinking to myself, well, what was it like being there this whole time, knowing you're innocent in prison among people who are mostly are guilty, and you're innocent. And what's it like, knowing you're innocent among guilty people, but everybody says they're innocent in prison. So, how do you distinguish yourself how do you differentiate between the liars and the people who are telling the truth, and the whole torment of that? And I want to know more about that, but the company I work for, it just doesn't allow for that kind of long form. We're not a long form journalistic operation. And even a long-form journalistic operation probably wouldn't do justice to it. In fact, the reality is my book, which tells 10 stories of wrongfully convicted people. You could argue that even this book doesn't do it justice, because each of these stories is roughly a magazine-length story telling in a fair amount of detail what happened to 10 different people from around the country. But you can only do your best, because. Nothing captures real life, of course, but we do our best to tell the stories as best we can. But as I say, in a breaking news format, you don't really do that. So that was kind of the spark of the original idea, like there's well over 1,000 people by now who've gotten exonerated, and they have these amazing stories to tell. And I would like to know more about what happened to them, and that was kind of what sparked the idea of the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, and I discuss this in my book as well. Depending, you can argue there's 5 or 6 different, main causes of wrongful conviction. But I go with 5, and it's really the same thing, the 5 and the 6. I think 5 combines 2 of them. It doesn't matter. Let's just go. There's 5 basic causes of wrongful conviction. I'll walk you through them, and just to give you a sense of what causes this to happen, and then I'll talk a little bit about some ideas of ways to change that. Let me close some of these. Okay, so the first cause of wrongful conviction that I'm going to talk about is false confessions. Okay, we've all seen this scenario in movies, I'm assuming. You know, where the guy gets like, you know, he's held like one hand on his belt, the other hand in his shirt, thrown into the interrogation room, sit down and talk, you know, and that's kind of the movie version, as I have here. But what it boils down to, you know, this actually isn't that far from the truth. People are brought in, and basically over the course of hours of pressure, of unimaginable pressure that really borders on psychological torture, they eventually confess to crimes they didn't commit. This accounts for roughly 13% of people who have gone to prison for crimes they didn't commit falsely confessed, and that was the main evidence that was used against them in court. So now let me tell you the story of a fellow who I write about in my book. This is a guy named Damon Thibodeau of Louisiana, of New Orleans. So this, of course, is when he was just a kid, about 20 years old. Some of you are 20 years old, so forgive me. You're not kids, but to me, you know, 20 years old is starting to feel kind of young. But in any event, he was 21 years old. This is him in more recent years when he was exonerated. But in any case, what happened to Damon is that he was 22 actually, and he was visiting. He was a deckhand. He worked on a steamship that went up and down the Mississippi River. And he went to go visit some cousins, and this 14-year-old cousin, a girl named Crystal, she said, I'm going to go to the grocery store now. Anyone need anything? Nope. All right, see you later. She went out to the grocery store and she never came back. So her mother got worried. Let's go out looking for her after a few hours. And basically over the course of several hours, a search party started seriously looking for her. They went to all of her favorite spots, a softball field, shopping mall, various different places that she would commonly go to. No one knew where she was, and nobody could find her. So, and one of the people who went out looking for her was Damon. 24 hours of straight searching went by, and Damon was exhausted. He went home. He just threw himself onto bed to take a nap. And he was just falling asleep when he heard a pounding on his door, and it was the police. And they said, you know, we want to question you to see what see what else you might know. If you were there when she disappeared. I mean, anything you can tell us would be great. So he said, sure. So they took him to the station. So, and as he was just sitting down at the police station, one of the detectives who was about to start asking him questions got a phone call saying that they found Crystal and that she was dead, and that she'd been beaten to death, and her body was found under a bridge, and she'd been raped as well. And basically what happened was, for reasons that still aren't exactly clear, one can deduce why, but the detective started getting on Damon, why'd you kill your cousin? And he said, well, I didn't kill my cousin. Well, this went on for hour after hour, and they employed what's called the Reed technique, which is a technique in which you basically you convince the guy you're questioning that all of his everyone else is saying he did it, and you're just screwing yourself by not admitting to it, because everybody from your father, your mother, your cousin, everybody's saying you're guilty, and you're denying it. So you'd better fess up, or things are going to get really bad for you. Well, after 9 hours of the most kind of intense interrogation imaginable, he finally said, well, the quote goes like this. He said, I didn't know I had done it, but I'd done it, he said. And he was actually sentenced to death for that. he sat on death row. And anyone knows anything about death row knows that it takes years and years of appeals before, if you do end up getting executed, you often sit on death row for at least like a dozen years. And he sat on death row for 15 years before all sorts of, while he was in there, he sought out help from innocence law firms that specialize in getting people free, but it takes forever if they even take your case. In any event, it took years and years, but a law firm did take him on, and were eventually able to gather enough evidence to show that he, in fact, did not kill his cousin. And he was set free. Now, one other thing I should just mention about being on death row, aside from knowing you're going to die, one of the worst things about death row is that you're actually in solitary confinement the whole time. So not only was he on death row, but he had like no physical contact basically with anybody for about 15 years. He was sort of just locked in a cage pretty much. He was allowed out of his cell for an hour a day, but only like he alone, one at a time, could leave their cell. So he's an amazingly, he drives a truck now, and he is amazingly, this is kind of his typical demeanor. He's a cheerful guy. It's really amazing. He's got a girlfriend, and he drives a truck all over the country, and he loves driving. He loves the freedom of the road, every day. He's gone back and forth 100 times by now. But basically, just getting back to the matter at hand, false confessions, it often happens to people who are mentally impaired, or sometimes they're just intoxicated when they end up confessing, or sometimes they just, like in Damon's case, they just don't know the law that well. They don't really understand that they have a right to an attorney when they're in an interrogation room, and they end up confessing, and that's it for them. So that's one major cause of wrongful conviction. The next one that I just want to mention is eyewitness misidentification, which accounts for 32% of wrongful convictions. This is a typical photo lineup, because most of the time when people think of lineups, they think of people standing. They do that very often too, as people line up in person, but sometimes they'll do it this way. And in the case of a guy named Cornelius Dupree, this is how it went down. So you've all read or are reading Picking Cotton? Yes. Okay. So Cornelius Dupree's story is kind of similar to the Picking Cotton story, in that a woman, his story is as follows. He was 19, he lived in Dallas, and he and a friend were on their way to a party, and there was a police checkpoint set up, and police said, they stopped them, just stop and frisk them. And, they found a couple things. Cornelius had nothing on him, but his friend had some pot in his pocket, and he also had a gun, which in Texas is not that unusual. But in any case, this was Cornelius when he was around that age. What happened was, they were taken in, for questioning and locked up for like about 24 hours, but I guess because, mainly because of the drugs. And they took photos of them, and the rape victim, what happened was when the woman who'd been raped, she was with her boyfriend at the time, and both of them had basically been held up, and both of them saw the attacker. Actually, it was two attackers, and so when the photo lineup was set up, the rape victim identified Cornelius as the rapist, and the boyfriend, he wasn't so sure. But then the photo lineup was enough evidence to prosecute. And when it went to trial, there was all kinds of back and forth about, there was the boyfriend kept on changing his mind about whether it was the right guy. The girlfriend seemed pretty set on it, and And basically when the trial happened, I'm going to quote the lawyer who was with the Innocence Project who ended up getting him out many years later. She said, "There's no more powerful evidence than a sympathetic, traumatized victim pointing a finger at the defendant and saying, 'I'm absolutely positive that that is the man who assaulted me. I will never forget his face as long as I live.'" In other words, I mean, if you're on a jury and the victim gets up there and says, "That's the man who raped me," particularly, if she's going to be upset, she's probably going to be crying, the jury will very likely be swayed and end up convicting the guy, which is what happened to Cornelius. So Cornelius ended up, and his friend were sentenced to 60 years in prison. Cornelius ended up doing 31 years, and then the Innocence Project found through DNA that neither he nor his friend were the rapists, and that's a whole. I don't have time to tell the whole story of how the Innocence Project figured that out, but it was just very fortunate that there was still evidence. There was some semen from 31 years ago that they were still able to get from some hair clippings, which was kind of an amazing stroke of good luck. But in any case, the issue of eyewitness misidentification, which accounts for about a third of all wrongful convictions. There's the problem with identifying, particularly in a photo lineup, is that, first of all, psychologically, if you've been through a trauma like a rape, there's going to be all kinds of biases. There's going to be all kinds of influences, and studies have shown that memory gets all screwed up if you've experienced a trauma. And it's a very unreliable test, and measures have come underway in more recent years to kind of come up with ways to make the test a little bit more reliable. One of the tests being, just for a couple examples, the officer who administers the test should not know who the perpetrator is in the lineup, because he may, through subtle means, influence the witness if he knows. So that's just one way of doing it. It's called blind administration, and then also there's another measure that was instated where in a lot of states where the witness, the victim, gives a what's called a confidence statement afterwards to sort of give an assessment of how confident she is that in fact is the person. So, but those are just two examples. But it's gotten a little better, but it's still a big cause of people going to prison wrongfully. This is what Cornelius looks like now. This was when he was actually out on parole when he was exonerated. He was out on, because typically you end up getting out. He was sentenced to 60 years, but he got out for 31 years. I do actually want to just add one thing about Cornelius, which is really he was one of the most inspiring people I interviewed, because what happened was he was offered a deal about 25 or so years into his sentence where they said you can get out of prison, but in exchange you have to take a sex what's it called? It's like a sex offender class, and he refused. He said, but I didn't. I'm not a sex offender. Why would I take a class? And admit I'm a sex offender if I'm not one. And the parole officer, basically he went back and forth, and he thought it over for a really long time, and he finally said, all right, I'll take the class if it means I can get out early. So he took the class, and the class is kind of like it's a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, where there's steps and towards kind of acceptance and admitting your guilt, and it finally got to the point in the class where he was he would have to get up in front of a group of people like the one I stand before, or of this size, and say, I raped this woman, and not only would he have to say he raped her, but he'd have to say how he raped her, and really kind of get into detail about it, for the purpose of producing a convincing story, give as much detail as possible. But essentially, he'd have to invent this whole story of how he raped her. And he's just like, that's it, I can't do it, I quit, I'm going to serve the rest of my time, and that's what he did. So he served an additional 6, 7, 8 years that he didn't have to serve because that's the kind of guy he is. You know, he's a man, he's a deeply religious man, and he said, you know, he accepted, you know, this is where I'm supposed to be right now, but I'm definitely not supposed to admit to a rape I didn't commit. Third most common type of cause of wrongful conviction that I'm going to get into now is bad forensic science. This is the reason I picked this photo is because I'm going to talk about fires, but there's all kinds of bad forensic science. Forensic science is, you know, when a crime happens, the forensics crew gets involved. They collect hair samples, they study them, they in the case of an arson, they'll go through the fire and search for well, I shouldn't say. In the case of a fire, they'll investigate to see if an arson was committed. Just if somebody dies, you know, they do an autopsy on the body to see, you know, the cause of death, and all that stuff goes under the category of forensics. After the crime is committed, piecing together, you know, doing the science to understand the cause of whatever happened. So I'm going to tell you the story of a guy from Chicago named James Kluppelberg. His story is very interesting and very tragic. James Kluppelberg is a guy who, when this guy was 19, he lived in a house in Chicago with his girlfriend, and she had some kids, and they all lived together, and also oddly, her ex-boyfriend also lived in the same house. He lived upstairs. It was more kind of a pity case because he was a drug addict, and she let him live with them. It was, you know, not the greatest living situation, but they all lived together like this. And one night, they were playing cards. They were hanging out at home, and they heard like ambulances, police cars, fire trucks. So they looked out the window, and they saw that a house that was like across the block, there was a huge inferno burning, a giant fire, and a whole apartment building was on fire. So, as anyone would do when you see something like that, you would typically come running out of your house to go check it out, watch the action, watch the firefighters put out the fire. It was a big spectacle. And then when it's over, as James and his family did, all right, we're safe now, the fire's out, went back inside, and more or less, you know, forgot about it altogether. It was a remarkable event that he saw, and that was the end of it. So that's the end of part one of this story. Now part two is, you know, 3 years later, he worked as a security guard, also in Chicago, and he noticed that he saw that 2 cars were on fire, and he called the cops. He said, hey, you know, they came to check it, you know, and you know, just called it in, a couple cars on fire. That's the end of part 2 of the story, okay? Part 3 of the story is that a month after the car fires, he was doing some repair work somewhere, because he also worked as a repairman. And these detectives came in and said, hey, you remember those car fires that you called us about a month ago? He said, yeah. He said, we were looking into them. Can we bring you down to the station to discuss those fires? He said, all right. So they brought him to the station and sat him down. They said, yeah, well, what we really want to talk to you about is why did you set that apartment building on fire 3 years ago that killed an entire family? All right. She says, he's like, fire? What fire? What are you talking about? And over the course of the minutes that commenced, he's like, okay, he remembered the fire now that had set the building on fire. He didn't know anything about a family that had died, but it turned out that in fact this family did die. It was the only survivor was the husband, but a mom and 5 of her kids all perished in this apartment fire. And basically, they start doing kind of what they did to Damon Thibodeau from earlier. This interrogation room. They're just screaming at him, "Why'd you do it? Why'd you do it?" They're beating him up. They actually, you know, they kicked him. He was urinating blood afterwards. And eventually, he actually confessed to that. He went to trial. The judge ended up throwing out the false confession, so it didn't impact him the way it impacted Damon. but he ended up going to prison because, for two main reasons. One of them was that you remember that girlfriend's ex-boyfriend I was telling you about? He did what's, well, they're called jailhouse snitches, but he basically falsely accused James of setting that fire as a deal to get out of some of his own criminal problems. That happens all the time too. I'll talk about that next. But the other major thing that got him thrown in prison was that the police captain who had been to that apartment fire at the time, and he'd done this very casual assessment of the fire, didn't take any notes or anything, but he testified at James's trial that he's like, this was an arson. He's like, the burn marks looked like arson to me, it was arson. And that was like a huge piece of evidence. That witness testifying was a huge part of what got James locked up, and he ended up doing 26 years in prison. And then when he got out, basically the arson science had evolved enormously. And it turned out that, in fact, the burn marks did not indicate arson. And the whole thing that the police captain had testified to was like the reverse of what it really was. And this is like just one example of so many times when forensics, it's just like the science is like so just ancient, it's very shoddy. I'll tell you real quick about this, another guy in my book. This is just a really quick one, but Drayton Witt, he's of Arizona. He went to prison for shaking his infant son to death. And the reason he went to prison is because when it was a baby who had all kinds of health problems, had a seizure and died, and when an exam was performed on the body, it was found that the baby had three signs on him: bleeding in the eyes and swelling and bleeding in the brain. And at the time, if a baby died and had those three symptoms, it was like automatically called baby shaking syndrome. That's when you obviously you shake a baby to death, and you go to prison for that. And then years later, a decade passed when all this research was done to find that there's a million other causes of baby shaking syndrome. Like those signs don't mean anything. And it was like this, and all that criteria came from this like 1971 study that this physician had done that was like ancient science, but it was still being used like years and years later to get a guy convicted. So the point is, a lot of this science, it's very unreliable, and people are going to prison for it. I'm going to talk about the second to last cause of wrongful conviction now, and that's false accusation or perjury. Now, I mentioned to you a little earlier, I just mentioned that this guy James, his boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend of his former girlfriend had been a snitch and had accused him of setting this fire, but then later he recanted and said he'd made the whole thing up. But basically there's this thing called jailhouse snitches. This is just an image I pulled up on Google, okay? But this is like, I guess maybe a sort of stereotypical idea of what you'd imagine a jailhouse snitch looking like. But basically it's a guy who has all kinds of legal problems, guy or girl, who is oftentimes in jail. And what they'll do is they'll testify against somebody in exchange for leniency in their case, or for a deal to not do any jail time, or something like that. And this accounts for, believe it or not, 55% of all wrongful convictions. You have some element of a false accusation in them. And in the case of a Kentucky man by the name of Kerry Porter, this is what happened to him. The story goes like this. This is in Louisville, Kentucky in 1998. It was actually the New Year's Eve, 1998. No, I'm sorry, maybe it was 95, I'm sorry. And a trucker, a guy by the name of Tyrone Camp, it was early AM, he was getting his truck ready, and somebody walked up to him with a with a gun with a carpet rolled around the muzzle as a silencer, and he shot the trucker in the head and killed him. So Kerry Porter became a suspect. Why? Because it's a convoluted story. There's a lot of characters involved, but it boils down to this. Kerry Porter used to be with a woman who was now married to the guy that was killed. And the victim's twin brother thought that Kerry might have done it. Yada yada. It's like a lot of. It's sort of like convoluted, but basically, it was enough to to put Kerry in jail to await trial for murder. While he was in jail, there was a fellow by the name of Greg Gully, who was it was later learned he was a jailhouse snitch in like dozens of cases. And he testified at Kerry's trial. That Kerry told me, we were watching an episode of Baywatch, and he told me that he killed Tyrone Camp. And he testified to this in court. And Porter got convicted. He went to prison for 13 years. And it was later learned that Gully, as I say, did this. It's like there's these career jailhouse snitchers who do it over and over again, and basically, like, because it's become such a problem, since detectives and prosecutors rely on jailhouse snitches so much to testify against defendants. Legislation has actually been put in place in several states, outlawing jailhouse snitches because it's such an unreliable way. Because they're so unreliable and there's so much reason to believe that they're lying, sometimes they're paid off even, that it's just not fair, because in the end, you've got a jury who's going to be convinced by these guys and who's going to convict somebody. The fifth and final cause of wrongful conviction that I'm going to get into now is kind of an all-encompassing thing. It's official misconduct. Official misconduct just sort of refers to any wrongdoing by the law enforcement involved. So, using a shoddy jailhouse snitch, for instance, would be an example of police misconduct. But let me bring this back up again. So Louis Scarcella, okay, this detective, he's sort of the classic, he's sort of the face of official misconduct. And official misconduct accounts for 47% of wrongful convictions these days. This is Louis Scarcella today. He's been in the news a lot lately, as I say, because of, I've actually met him a couple times myself. He lives in Staten Island. And it's just this thing where, so they're doing all sorts of things to get people convicted. Withholding evidence from the defense that would free their client, destroying evidence, using unreliable witnesses like Greg Gully, using fraudulent experts, because in trials you often bring an expert up, like a professor of some kind, to testify, using their expertise to explain why such and such would be true or not true, and sometimes they use like unqualified unqualified experts. The brief version of the story of Devon Ayers is this. Devon Ayers was a kid from the Bronx who, he was 17, and there were 2 murders committed in his neighborhood in Soundview, which is in the Bronx. At the time, well, the Bronx was a very tough neighborhood. It's still, parts of the Bronx are still pretty tough, but at the time, Soundview was not a very safe neighborhood. And Ayers, he was a teenage. He sold crack on street corners, but was otherwise, he actually had given up. He had just given up the selling of crack because he had a daughter. And what happened to him was there were these 2 murders. First, a woman who worked for UPS was found dead in her apartment. She was riddled with bullet holes, and she had her hands were cuffed behind her. And then that was murder number 1. And then a couple days later, a livery cab driver was found dead in his car. And what basically happened was the detectives who were assigned these cases ended up linking the two murders, that it was like some sort of cocaine deal gone wrong. And Devon and several of his friends ended up getting fingered as the perpetrators and ended up going to prison. And he has said he was 17. He was 19 when this happened, but he was 17. He did 17 years in prison before, basically, all sorts of evidence came up to show that it was just very unlikely that he and his friends were involved, and he's out. And as you could see, it was a very emotional event for him to be set free. So. But as I say, Scarcella, that detective I showed you earlier, he's sort of the face of misconduct, which is, as I say, can include destroying evidence, unreliable witnesses, or also coercing. One of the things Scarcella was found to have done was he would do this thing where there'd be a lineup, and he would basically take the witness inside and be like, listen, like if that one. I think he referred to David Rant as the one with the big nose. He's like, the big nose, that's the one who did it, So that's the one you're going to say did it. And then the victim would come back and point to David Rant. And he would do things like that, and he would do things, as I said earlier, he would use the same witness again and again in like a slew of cases across the city. Now, one thing you should know about these 5 examples of, well, I showed you more than 5, I showed you 6 or 7, but these few people that I've mentioned to you who were wrongfully convicted, and the people who I profile in my book, that's 10, are just a tiny fraction of the people who actually get out. You should know that the people who, the vast majority of people who get wrongfully convicted are still in prison now and are never going to get out. And the reason that is because it's so hard to free a person who's once they're already convicted. Aside from the appeals process taking so long, it's just that the challenges you face, like if you get wrongfully convicted, first of all, can I find a law firm that's going to get me out? There's these innocence law firms across the country, but they're like real skeleton crews. It's like 1 or 2 lawyers who receive like dozens and dozens of letters every day from people saying, they're innocent, can you help me? And then they go through those letters and they do like a cursory look at the case, and they sort of decide, like, is this something that, first of all, is this defendant even telling the truth? And okay, we think they're telling the truth, but is this case even resolvable? I mean, can we investigate this? Do we have any hope? There's so much, digging through and finding old evidence is like nothing short of a miracle most of the time. And it's so hard, so lawyers who get people out of prison only take like the very, very, very best cases where like there's even a shot. Most of them there is no shot. And if you look at the number of studies that have been done that say anywhere from, like, very roughly speaking, 2 to 3 to 5% of all people who are in prison right now on felonies, which are like more of the major crimes, are innocent. So in other words, we're talking about a number as high as 100,000 people in prison are innocent. Now, I mean, I'm not saying 100,000 people in prison are innocent nowadays, but it could be that high. And just the idea that it could be that high is something that, it should startle a person. That being said, there is in hope. I mean, the fact that you're studying this subject matter right now and I'm here speaking to you about it means that the topic of wrongful convictions has become of interest. When I say of interest, meaning like people are paying attention to it. I'm covering it more and more as a reporter. You read about it more and more. Picking Cotton is a New York Times bestseller. I mean, there's a reason for that. It's because this is becoming an ever-growing subject of interest, and that's a good thing. In 1989, when the National Registry of Exoneration started keeping track of how many people were exonerated, it was 21 people in 1989 got out of prison, and in last year there were 125. But that's a big increase. I mean, although, as I say, 125 is still just a a drop in the bucket. But there's hope, in other words. You know, there's a trend here where there's just growing awareness and there's change. So, and I guess, I mean, what I suggest in my book, which is just what the average person can do, is keep it as a subject of interest. You know, talk about it. You know, if you care enough, you know, look up, you know, Google what innocence organizations are near you, and if you want to volunteer for them, because for each case they need thousands of man hours per case which are pro bono. You know, free work being done that gets these people out of prison. You know, and I suggest, you know, just like if you know, if you like reading about these stories, you know, you email the reporters and say, you know, I want to see more stories like this, because the media plays a huge role also in keeping the public's eye on these cases. So those are just a couple of things that I suggest you can do. I mean, maybe it's not much, but again, I mean, you know, the things that generally bring change to the world, if it's the civil rights of the 1960s, you know, whatever it is, it's just like when enough people are angry about something, basically. That tends to move things. You know, prison people. You know, everyone's talking about prison reform right now. Prison reform being, you know, one of the top topics of one of the top subject matter in the presidential campaign right now. So there's all this talk of prison reform. It's a subject. It's a topic of interest that people care about. So the idea is to keep caring about it, basically, and hopefully over time you'll see less and less, more and more legislation that brings the number of wrongful convictions down, and meanwhile all that good work being done brings the number of exonerations up. So that's the trend we hope to see over time. And that's about it, folks. That's my lecture for you. But I mean, I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. Yes, young man.
First of all, thank you for coming.
Sure.
Probably misheard when you said the percentage on bad forensic science. Mm-hmm. Was there any percentage?
There was, yes. 22%. I don't think I said it, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. And these numbers overlap. As if you're paying attention, you'd see I went over 100% with all the percentages, but that's only because, like, most of the time, one or more of these causes I gave you contribute to somebody's wrongful conviction. So that's why it probably went up to like 150% or something like that. Yeah. Or.
Yeah, okay. My name is Makini.
Hello.
Hello. So I have a question about David Renter. Mm-hmm. So did he have any past criminal life that the detective used against him?
He had a record. He had a criminal record. I don't remember what it was specifically, but I mean, it was generally small stuff. That's not uncommon. You know, I mentioned the last guy I mentioned, Devon Ayers. You know, he sold crack at the shortly before he. Also, the guy from Kerry Porter. He had like this crazy criminal record. He stole like hundreds and hundreds of cars over the course of his. So I mean, some of these guys aren't necessarily the most savory types, but. Many of them are have no criminal record at all. I mean, James Kuppelberg from Chicago, the one who was accused of setting the fire, he had no criminal record. He had a very small thing against him. But the point is that many times they have none at all, and it's like that ends up, it ends up hurting them in some cases because the prosecutor will use that against them. Oh, look at this guy! Look what he's already done. He stole so many cars. He did drugs. I mean, why would you not want to convict this guy? So it ends up hurting in some cases if there's already a criminal record, which is unfortunate.
Thank you.
Sure.
The detective, was he persecuted? Was his the cases that he won, were they looking to reevaluate it, or what came out from the detective and all these things?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. It's ongoing, but yes, every conviction that he was responsible for, which number is somewhere, it's in the double digits. It's like 60 or something like that. They're all being reassessed. In fact, the Brooklyn District Attorney opened up a whole division in his office just to look into cases where wrongful conviction is suspected. And all of his cases are being looked at. I think so far like 4 or 5 people have been let out of prison already for cases that he handled. As far as his own situation, he's not being prosecuted right now. He's still. I mean, his reputation is destroyed. He's got, which in and of itself is a tough thing to deal with. It's not as bad as going to prison for a crime he didn't commit. But will there be? I don't know if there'll eventually be prosecution against him. I don't know. There may be a statute of limitations. I'm not sure whether he would be prosecuted, but certainly his cases are being looked at, and we'll see. Sure.
So, can we, from what I heard and from what I see, can we safely say that the system of government, this is a perfect example of what the system doesn't do? I mean, there must be change, but this is a perfect example for not doing nothing.
Well spoken. Yeah, it's very true. It's kind of unbelievable because well, a lot of the people who I wrote about in my book, they up until the millisecond that the jury foreman said guilty, they believed that I'm going to be found not guilty, because none of them could believe that it was possible that it could come this far. They're like, all right, I got arrested. Okay, I'll get out of this because I didn't do it. I'll get out of this. All right, I'm put in jail. I have to wait a trial. And some of them, when you get arrested, sometimes you have to wait a trial for like 2 years. So you're sitting in jail for 2 years before you even go to trial, which is in and of itself. Most of these people don't even talk about the jail part. Like they just take it for granted that you have to sit in jail for 2 years waiting for your trial. But they're in jail. They're like, all right, I can get through this because once I go to trial, this will all be straightened out. Okay. And then they go to trial and they sit there. And some of them say, like, I sat in for my trial and I was barely even paying attention to the testimony because, like, I was like so confident that like this is all going to be straightened out. And then like and then until finally the moment when they're ordered to stand and then they hear the guilty verdict, and several of them just described it as I felt like I'd never been so cold in my life. They describe the cold because they're just completely struck dumb. Like how could this be? Because all along, like, I'm on trial, but I'm in this stately courtroom with wood paneling on the walls, and all these attorneys are wearing suits and seem so dignified, and the government, the prosecutorial team, these are all government employees, and they seem so dignified, and they seem, this is our government, this is this can't be happening to me, and then the fact that it does, it kind of lays waste to the whole the whole kind of paradigm, our whole idea of the stability of government that we trust. Basically, it lays all that to waste, and it's a very scary thing to realize that everything that seems orderly is actually very disorderly, or disorderly enough that it could cause things like this to happen. I mean, you could also be an optimist and say, well, most of the time it does work out properly, which is true, and you can't discount that. But and it's the same thing when people talk about police misconduct, police. Right now, a huge news story is just again and again you hear about police shooting, police shootings, people dying from cops, well, you could argue, most cops are okay, and very few of them end up shooting people unjustly. But the problem is, well, you could say, well, yeah, but what about the people who are dead now? What about their families? So, even if it's a relatively small percentage of wrongdoing, it's still enough that we just can't, just the idea of having these horrifying circumstances are just kind of unacceptable. So, yes, it's a scary thing to accept. And a lot of people, they go their whole lives thinking, like, just trusting their government. And then this kind of stuff happens. So it's a good point you raise.
It's not just like the government, it's like a betrayal of society, because society is government. So it just must, try to imagine that the society which you were born into is turning against you. It's so surreal. It must take a long time to catch up.
Yeah, and it takes just to accept, like, it takes some of these people years to even like realize what happened to them, what really happened to them, and to accept it. Because as you say, I mean, it's like a nightmare. It's like a horror movie. You know, like those horror movies where everything seems normal, but there's really something sinister underneath, and like nothing is as it really should be. And it's very frightening. I mean, it's society at large. It's as you say. I mean, it just conjures all sorts of nightmare scenarios. Like, what's that guy? No, I'm pointing to you. But what I mean is like. Who knows what all these? It's frightening in the same way as like not knowing which of you in the crowd is a killer or something like that, or just like who do I trust, who do I not trust? Like it's like these. It's almost like a thriller movie or like a horror movie.
You said you met with the detective. Did he have like any remorse for what he's done?
Well, it's just to clarify, I once went to his house to try to talk to him, and he basically said, like, I don't want to talk to you, and but he was nice about it. Like, we spoke a little bit, but he wouldn't really address the subject at hand. But he's done interviews though. He's done like interviews that he's arranged through his lawyer. He didn't like being. A lot of what I have to do in my job is just like I basically like not ambush people, but well, I do kind of ambush people. Like I come up to people unexpectedly at their door, and they're like, whoa, and that's kind of what happened in this case with him. But he's done interviews. Where has he expressed remorse? No, not really. I mean, it's actually like there was a really interesting GQ. I think it was GQ had it, like a big sit-down interview with him. I think he actually defends himself. He's like, I did not do this. He's like, I did my job well. I mean, as I recall, I read the story a couple of years ago, but as I recall, I don't think he expressed any remorse. I think he maintains that he. Yeah, I think he maintains that he did a good job.
And I have another question. You had said about the snitching in jail. In the book that we read, Picking Cotton, he actually had the rapist of Jennifer Thompson come forward to the trial, and would that be like discounted now? Like, I mean, if they gave it consideration, he could have possibly had his case looked at earlier.
So, so I understand that question. You're saying, like, if the rape victim, who, and I guess like they're friends now, right?
Yeah.
If she had come. Okay, so ask me the question one more time.
I'm sorry. So
that's okay.
Let me further explain it better. So he was in jail with the man who actually committed the rape, who is separate from him. Yeah, Cotton was in jail with the actual rapist, Bobby Uhl, and he had brought him to trial, the second trial that he was going on, and he had said that he was the rapist, and he had swore under oath, Bobby Uhl, that he didn't commit the rape, and they had someone who came forward and said he confessed to me in jail that he actually had done the rape. So in cases like that, where it is telling the truth, does that now get discredited because of how likely it is that they have snitches with wrong information? Sorry, did that make sense? That was a lot.
Sort of. I mean, my head's spinning a little bit right now. I'm also really tired, though. At the same time. So,
I think I can
yeah.
understand what you're saying.
Sure.
You're saying, is jailhouse snitch testimony uniformly discounted now?
Okay. Yeah. All right. It's. It's still used, and it kind of also depends on which state. Like some states are more on top of this than other states. I think in my book I even mentioned which states are it depends on which states have taken it seriously enough to build reforms. I mentioned a few. Wisconsin, New Jersey, North Carolina are among some of the states that. I'm sorry. No, I'm looking at. Bear with me. I'll cite my own paragraph here, but I talk about how, states have been slow to pass laws preventing jailhouse snitches from being so influential, but there have been a few. So I mentioned that in California, in 2011, California Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill preventing judges and juries from relying solely on the testimony of jailhouse snitches. So that's but that's just California. So I mean, it really kind of depends on state by state. But earlier when I spoke of awareness, what I'm hearing more and more often now that if a snitch is mentioned, it's a lot easier now. It's getting easier for lawyers to argue like, oh, that's a jailhouse snitch, and to anticipate investigating the snitch to see what the snitch's motivations are. Whereas I think like a few years ago, lawyers, particularly really busy public defense lawyers, were less likely to look into the snitch to make sure the snitch was legit. Some snitches are legit, but many of them aren't. But again, awareness is a problem. That actually just made me think of another really quick. When I mentioned public defenders, part of the problem is that many people who are charged with crimes, who end up going to trial or taking plea deals, they're defended by public defenders who just simply, it's basically like public defenders are like basically underpaid lawyers who don't have time or necessarily the right amount of experience or skills to like properly represent somebody. So they often have like this giant amount of cases that they're handling, and they just can't prepare for a trial properly. So when you talk about like problems like making sure that the jailhouse snitch is okay, like they wouldn't necessarily have the time to look into that to make sure, and that's its own huge problem. The whole public defender, whereas when you have certain people who have the means to pay for like top-notch defense attorneys are more likely to be acquitted. The most famous case being O.J. Simpson and his dream team of lawyers who defended him. Not everybody has the means to defend themselves that way. So.
How do you feel when you interview a offender who's not really offender?
So like, how do I feel personally? Like, how does it make me feel inside? So in other words, like, what's it been like writing this book and speaking to all these people? It's really been life-changing. I went into this project, it was interesting. My motivations for writing the book ended up shifting dramatically over the course of writing the book, because when I first started working on it, I was really like, I just kind of wanted to do it because I was just really fascinated by the stories themselves. I mean, like, what's this like? As I mentioned earlier, what's it like going to a prison for a crime you didn't commit? It's a very fascinating, grimly fascinating subject. And then over time, I guess I was so changed by interviewing these people. It was very intense conversations that I had with these people. I mean, like, it was very, I spent so many hours. I mean, well over 100 hours interviewing everybody all together. And when you spend that much time on one subject, I mean, it changes you, and it moves you. It makes you not only, I think, more cynical of the government, of society, but it just kind of makes you, I guess most of us aren't used to being in such close proximity to people who've been through such an extraordinary experience like that. I guess it's kind of hard to explain how it changed me, but it certainly made me more. Well, I put it this way, I never really considered myself an advocate of anything. I just consider myself more of a storyteller. But after writing this book, I feel like I'm much more of an advocate for people who have been wrongfully convicted, and I wasn't expecting that. But it sort of happened on its own because it just didn't seem, I guess because I felt changed. I felt like I really care about this now.
And I have another question. Do you ever study the offender's brain after they got released?
So in terms of like scientifically studying their brain, no. But
No, the behavior.
yeah, I mean, psychologically, I've given a lot of thought to the psychology of how people have psychologically changed. What surprised me the most of the people I interviewed is that most of them had amazingly positive outlooks on life after spending all this time in prison, and they all shared this common thing where they all looked at it like, I lost so many years of my life. I don't want to give this a second more, I don't want to devote any more time to this. I don't want to dwell on it. I don't want to obsess over it. I don't want to be depressed about it. I have far too few years left now that I lost to waste any more time on the time that was already wasted. So other than speaking to me to tell their stories, because they felt like that would be a greater for the greater good to help me write this book, you know, to help prevent this from happening in the future. But other than that, they just didn't want to waste any more time talking about it. So the outlook has been very positive. However, it definitely can screw you up. I mean, everybody, I think, is traumatized. One guy in particular who I did not mention, his name is Thomas Kennedy, and he's from Washington. He's in my book, and he did about a decade behind bars because his daughter, who was 7 at the time, accused him of raping her. And he went to prison, and then eventually she explained how she made the whole thing up. So that's a particularly devastating case because first of all, you're going to prison for a crime you didn't commit. You're also dealing with, you know, your child who you love, and there's this horrifying conflict now between you and your loved one. I don't know what that's like. Well, as Katie Couric interviewed this guy, and she said to him, you know, if I had been you and my daughter did that to me, I'd want to strangle her, you know. Well, you can just imagine how horrifying it is, and then of course another horrible thing is that when you go to prison for any kind of child rape, child molestation type of case, other inmates take that they don't take well to that, and they tend to kind of persecute you in prison. They attack you, they try to kill you, they make life very hard for you if that's what you were convicted of. So it's very bad to go to prison for any kind of child case. So anyway, he had 10 years of hell before getting out, and he's very fragile. He didn't even want to talk to me at first. In fact, what happened with him is that it was one of those times where, you know, I'd reached out to his lawyer, and he ended up calling me, and he called me to tell me that he did not want to do the interview. And then it was one of those things that happens every once in a while where the no comment ends up turning into telling me the whole story. And over time, we developed a relationship, and he grew to trust me. And his chapter is arguably my favorite in the book. His name's Thomas Kennedy. It just moved me a lot, you know. And I've completely the guy's disappeared. I had mailed him a copy of my book, and it just came back to me in the mail. It was the wrong. He changed addresses. I don't know. His cell phone numbers changed. I don't know what happened. I mean, he's you know, I don't know how he's doing, but he's very fragile, you know.
I have a question. The theme of our common read this year is forgiveness. And although you're sharing with us the stories of these people who've gone through so much and that they're looking to get beyond it, as you said, they've already spent so much time on this. What is their sense? Have they shared any information with you about forgiveness? Are they able to forgive the people who wrongly convicted those witnesses, or those snitches? Are they able to forgive at all? Or is this something that you think is going to just haunt them forever?
Yeah, well, the short answer to your question is that it varies from person to person. But I do want to mention that Carrie Porter again. No, not Carrie Porter. A guy named Muhammad Donray Adams, who I did not mention. He's from Philadelphia. He's on the cover of the book. He's, you can't really see him, but he's this guy right here. He went to prison because this woman testified that she saw him shoot these 2 drug dealers to death. And then she later recanted and said she made the whole thing up. And I asked him about, and he when he was in trial, she testified against him, and he was describing his rage. Maybe I'll just quickly. I open up his chapter with that story. Maybe I'll just read you a few paragraphs, because I open up I opened up the chapter where he's in trial and he's listening to this woman lie about him. So he said, I write, he'd think about her all the time, the woman whose lies put him in prison. Donna Benjamin, that crackhead, that small-time crook, that nobody who told cops he'd shot 2 men to death and who swore the same at his trial. Muhammad Donner Adams would think about her every day from inside that grimy Pennsylvania lockup, and he'd pray to God with all his might that she would meet a vicious death. In other words, he was extremely pissed at this woman. But what's funny is that she, and I say, like, in court, hearing her spin such, he's in court, he said, hearing her spin such lies, Adams could hold it in no longer. That bitch lying, Adams said loud enough for the judge to hear. His Honor told Adams' lawyer to control his client. That bitch lying, Adams said again louder now. I ain't killed these people. Because he's just so enraged listening to this woman lie about him. And for years he wanted her dead. And he tells me he actually had the power to make that happen. If had he wanted to, he could have arranged for her death by hiring somebody, which he'd considered. But he eventually forgave her. And it's a funny thing. He said she calls him about once a month, would be just being like, I'm so sorry, and he's like, it's okay, just forget about it, because basically it all comes back to the same thing. It's like, I've got too much living to do. I'm just looking for one more. She says, she talks about how it keeps on bothering her, Adam says. She cries a lot. She cries every time she calls me. She tells me about the things that are happening to her in her life, bad things, her house caught on fire, her daughter got stabbed. Every calamity that happens to her, she thinks is the punishment that God is giving her for what she'd done to me. But I tell her, listen, I forgive you, and I forgave you, and I asked God to do the same. You have to get on your knees and ask God for forgiveness to relieve you of the demons within you. And basically what it comes to, it's like, a lot of people have kind of religious epiphanies when they're in prison, partly because, a lot of people find religion because it's like, it's the only way to cope with a disaster like this, is to believe that this is all in God's power, God's plan, and in any event, he found forgiveness, and it was part of his own healing, I think. Sure.
So, we've been showing the movie The Central Park Five, and Jim Dwyer, the journalist, he was a journalist at the Times, and he talks about how journalism failed those kids at the time and when they got exonerated. Do you feel like you have become a better, more skeptical journalist because of knowing about wrongful conviction? When you do crime coverage, do you think more deeply about it maybe, or do you think about it differently, or?
I most definitely do. It's it talks about when journalism failed those kids, and it's journalists. Journalism is definitely, by and large, guilty of the whole phenomenon of guilty until proven innocent, which is essentially saying that we think you did it, and we're going to basically do everything but say you're the killer. We'll put the word killer in parentheses, maybe just to we'll call you a killer, but we'll put killer in parentheses so that we're not actually calling you a killer. But there's this thing that I talk about this in my book too. So there's a thing called a perp walk, and a perp walk is when the police walk the perpetrator out of the police station, And all this media is there to kind of photograph it. I mean, if no one's ever seen it before, I'll just Google perp walk. We all, you know, it's a very kind of classic news event. Okay, it's this thing. You know, this is actually Dominique Strauss. This is one of the most famous perp walks ever, which him. Okay, and you know the way it's typically perceived. I mean, without saying as much, we're saying we're saying that this guy is guilty in the picture. Now, in fairness, I mean, as I say, most of the time, law enforcement actually is doing a proper job. What's newsworthy is when they're not doing a proper job. But, and to their credit, what doesn't make the news is how often they actually do a good job. And most of the people they arrest, you know, there was a thorough investigation done, and the person really the evidence it's very likely the person is guilty. Oftentimes, I've been on lots of stories where you know, video surveillance showed the perpetrator killing the guy, and it's just so clear that the person did it. And you know, whether or not they still may not be found guilty in court. Maybe there'll be a what's the defense called where they say they're crazy. You know, insanity, yeah, or the plead insanity or something like that. I mean, but the point is whether they did it or not. You know, the answer is most of the time yes. But I'm skeptical. I really am skeptical, and I don't like seeing. I don't like seeing the media go on the assumption every time that the person is guilty, because I have seen cases where the person is acquitted. I've seen it several times where, you know, on the front page of every you know, including the Post, it's like we're basically you know, screaming out the guilt of the person on the cover. I mean, listen. I mean, on a lighter note, you know, I don't know if there's any Patriots fans in this room. But I'm a Patriots fan because I'm from Boston. And, you know, when this whole Deflategate thing was going on, okay, I was pissed because, you know, I don't believe that Tom Brady's guilty, okay? So, and it angered me just to see what ESPN was doing and what the New York Post was really going heavy on. My own newspaper was going really heavy on Tom Brady. And I was unhappy about that. Now, that's kind of a trivial thing, okay? But you know, it does play into this whole idea of you know, innocent until proven guilty, and we shouldn't go on this assumption that, you know, to demonize people when we don't know the facts, because that's an aspect of human nature that we should all that we're all probably guilty of at one point or another in our lives. You know, drawing conclusions based on very limited information, and it's a terrible human trait that we should all work on ourselves to not do.
Please join me in thanking our special guest, Mr. Reuven Fenton.